As they stepped onto the bustling campus of Westbridge University, James and Ethan felt the pull of possibility. The thrilling rush of new faces, unexplored paths, and the chance to reinvent themselves. In those first hours of freshman orientation, laughter mixed with nervous energy as their personalities began to unfold. James, ever the optimist, and Ethan, a bit more reserved but keenly curious. From that very first meeting, a spark was ignited. One that would set them on a path of friendship, discovery, and, eventually, change. James Carter scanned the packed orientation hall, feeling a wave of anxiety bubbling under his cool exterior. It was as if 1,000 faces were all staring at him, though he knew none of them were. He was tall, with a natural confidence in his walk and a keen, observant gaze. But today, even he felt slightly out of his element. New school, new people, new everything. He took a breath, pulled his shoulders back, and slid into an empty seat in the back row, hoping to stay somewhat invisible. Moments later, a flash of movement caught his eye as a lanky guy with a messy shock of sandy hair practically collapsed into the seat beside him, grinning and slightly out of breath. The newcomer looked over at James with an easy smile, holding out his hand in greeting. "Hey, I'm Ethan Thompson," he said, his voice as casual as if they'd known each other for years. James hesitated just a beat before shaking his hand. "James Carter. You as nervous as I am?" Ethan laughed, scratching the back of his head. "I feel like I'm about to take some test I didn't study for." James chuckled, the tension melting away with the ease of Ethan's manner. "Yeah, maybe a little. Big place. A lot of new faces." Ethan nodded, gesturing around. "Yep, and I know approximately none of them." For the next few minutes, they exchanged small talk about where they were from. James shared that he was from a city suburb, while Ethan described growing up in a small, mostly conservative town where everyone knows everyone and nobody minds their own business. They laughed, easing into the conversation. Soon, the topic drifted to music, and the realization dawned on them that they both had a love for rock, blues, and hip-hop. Wait, you're telling me you listen to Hendrix and Kendrick?" Ethan said, raising an eyebrow. "Man, good music is good music," James replied with a shrug. Just then, the orientation speaker took the stage and began droning through a welcome speech. Ethan nudged James with his elbow, whispering some exaggerated commentary that had James stifling laughter. The more Ethan cracked little jokes, the more they relaxed, feeling an unexpected kinship in their shared humor and quick camaraderie. By the end of the session, they'd agreed to meet up later, not just because they were already friends, but because it felt natural. Later that day, James lugged a box down the fourth-floor hallway of Parker Hall, looking for room 406. His muscles strained slightly as he tried to keep a firm grip on the box while balancing his duffel bag slung across one shoulder. When he reached the door, he nudged it open with his foot, maneuvering his way inside and setting the box on his bed. The room was small and bare, 2 twin beds on opposite sides, 2 desks, and a shared closet. He looked around, mentally calculating how much of his stuff he could fit in his side of the room. Just as he began unpacking, there was a sudden knock, and then the door swung open to reveal a familiar face. "Room 406. "No way," Ethan exclaimed, his voice filled with genuine surprise and excitement. James looked up, grinning. "You've got to be kidding me. You're my roommate?" "Looks like it." Ethan dropped his own bag on the floor, running a hand through his unruly hair with a laugh. "Man, talk about a small world." They both laughed, the coincidence somehow cementing the fact that they were meant to meet each other. While they unpacked, they chatted about what they planned to do with their new space. James pulled out posters of socially conscious rappers, legends like Tupac and Nas, alongside quotes about equality and justice that he wanted to pin on his wall. Ethan took out his own collection, faded classic rock posters, including a beat-up Led Zeppelin one, and an old map of the U.S. his grandfather had passed down. They made a few jokes about their different styles, but felt no need to hide their tastes. They were already settling into a comfortable rhythm, the kind where they could be themselves, no pretense. "So," Ethan said, finally plopping down on his bed, "guess we're officially stuck together now, huh?" "Looks that way," James replied, smirking. "Hope you're ready for it, man." "Oh, I'm ready. But are you? Ethan shot back, laughing as they both sank into the comfort of their new reality. They were roommates, friends, maybe more than just that. The campus was hosting a game night at the student center that evening, and Ethan was more than eager to drag James along. He practically bounced down the hall, coaxing James into tagging along. The student center was packed with the sound of laughter, clinking billiard balls, and shuffling cards. Ethan eyed the pool table, a glint in his eye, and challenged James to a game. "You sure you're up for it?" James teased, picking up a cue stick. "Oh, bring it on," Ethan replied with a mock glare. The game began, and Ethan's confidence quickly wavered as James nailed shot after shot. Each time Ethan managed to get a ball in, James responded by sinking two more. "All right, I'm calling it now. You've been hustling me this whole time," Ethan complained with mock outrage as James lined up another perfect shot. James laughed, shaking his head. "It's all skill, man. Can't help it if you don't have it." They exchanged banter, laughing and joking as they traded shots. Between turns, they shared stories from high school. James told Ethan about the friends he had back home, his close-knit neighborhood, and the local community center where he sometimes volunteered. Ethan, in turn, shared tales from his small-town life. His high school's obsession with Friday night football, the handful of good-natured but nosy neighbors, and his battles with a strict curfew. "Small-town life sounds pretty wild," James said, grinning. "Not much of that where I'm from." Ethan shrugged. "I bet, but I think I'd trade a few good bonfires for the city, you know?" By the end of the game, they'd both stopped keeping score, more interested in the steady rhythm of their conversation than in winning. James realized Ethan was someone he could talk to openly, even laugh with in a way that felt natural. He hadn't expected to find a friend so soon, but here they were, two strangers who felt like they'd known each other for ages. Later that night, back in their dorm room, the lights dimmed to a soft glow from a single desk lamp, casting the room in a warm, quiet light. Both of them lay on their beds, a comfortable silence settling between them. "So," Ethan said suddenly, staring at the ceiling, "what do you really want to do? I mean, like, why are you here?" James thought about that for a moment, his fingers absent-mindedly tapping on the edge of his bed. "I want to make music," he said finally. "I've been writing and rapping since middle school. It's my way of expressing things that don't always have easy answers." Ethan looked over at him, intrigued. "Like what?" "Stuff like injustice, inequality. You know, things that don't sit right," James replied, his voice soft but intense. "I feel like music's my way to reach people, to make them think. I want to do more than just make songs. I want to make a difference." Ethan listened, nodding slowly. "That's powerful, man. I don't think I've ever been that sure about anything. What about you?" James asked, turning the question back. "Why'd you choose to come here?" Ethan laughed, a bit embarrassed. "Honestly, I'm still figuring that out. My family's got a pretty rigid idea of what I should do. Something stable, something respectable, you know? But I think I want to find my own path." James nodded, understanding more than he let on. They continued talking about their dreams, doubts, and the futures they wanted to carve out. It was a vulnerable conversation, one they both knew wasn't typical for two guys who'd only just met, but something about it felt right. By the time they fell asleep, they'd each revealed pieces of themselves they hadn't expected to share, and it felt like the beginning of a deeper, lasting connection. The following day, James and Ethan decided to check out a rally on campus hosted by the Black Student Union. The rally was organized to promote diversity and inclusion, calling for more representation and justice on campus. James was right at home, joining in the chants with a passion that lit up his eyes. Ethan, on the other hand, hung back a little, watching with a mix of interest and uncertainty. The crowd's energy was intense, with people holding up signs and cheering for the speakers who took turns sharing powerful messages. One speaker, a senior and prominent activist on campus, talked passionately about the responsibility of allies to speak up and use their privilege to support marginalized communities. Ethan felt a knot tighten in his stomach as he listened, realizing he'd never thought about the world in this way before. His whole life, he'd seen himself as someone neutral, someone who wasn't part of the problem. But now he wondered if silence was complicity. After the rally, James turned to Ethan, his face alive with excitement. What did you think? Ethan hesitated, processing his thoughts. It was eye-opening, to say the least. I guess I never realized how much goes unnoticed unless you're looking for it. James nodded, understanding in his eyes. It's a lot to take in, but just being here, trying to understand, that's a start. They walked back to the dorm in comfortable silence, each of them aware that this was more than just a college friendship. They were on a path that would challenge them, teach them, and maybe change them forever. In the following weeks, James and Ethan fell into a rhythm. They attended classes, studied together, and continued exploring the new and often overwhelming world of college life. Their friendship deepened, strengthened by their late-night talks, shared interests, and experiences that felt like small but meaningful rituals. But college also brought challenges neither of them had fully anticipated, especially as their differences began to show in ways that felt impossible to ignore. Act 2 takes them through their first real test of friendship. Moments of misunderstanding, awkwardness, and hard conversations that would force them both to question what it meant to truly support each other. It was Friday night, and James and Ethan were headed to a popular local bar with a group of students from their dorm. The air was electric with the sounds of laughter, clinking glasses, and the steady thrum of music. For James, this was a new scene. He wasn't used to the bustling energy of college bars, but he was intrigued by the sense of freedom and adventure. Ethan, on the other hand, was in his element. He chatted easily with the group, flashing his casual grin and sharing jokes that had everyone laughing. As the night went on, they all relaxed, enjoying the buzz of excitement that comes from a week's worth of classes finally melting away. They ordered a round of drinks, and James was just beginning to feel at ease when he heard a voice from a nearby table. A voice directed squarely at him. "Hey, check it out," the guy said loudly, clearly aiming his comment toward his own group, but making no attempt to lower his voice. "The only black guy in here. Bet he's got moves." James stiffened, his easy smile disappearing as he set his drink down, his jaw tight. He felt the familiar, bitter prickle of discomfort, a reminder of just how quickly a room could turn hostile, even if just through a single thoughtless comment. Ethan, who'd been laughing at something else, didn't seem to notice. But when he glanced over and saw James's expression, he grew concerned. "Hey," Ethan murmured, leaning closer. "You all right?" James gave a stiff nod, brushing it off, but he couldn't shake the unease. "Yeah, just feeling a bit tired, I guess." Ethan looked around, catching sight of the guy at the other table who'd made the comment. He pieced it together, his brow furrowing with discomfort, but he hesitated. Part of him wanted to say something, but another part of him felt unsure, not wanting to stir up trouble or draw attention. Maybe we should head out," Ethan suggested finally, a bit too casually. James nodded, grateful for the suggestion, though his jaw remained tight. They left without a word, slipping into the cool night air, both quiet as they walked back to the dorm. The night, which had started off full of promise, now hung heavy with the unspoken tension between them. Back in their dorm room, James threw his jacket onto his bed with a little more force than necessary, then turned to face Ethan. His voice was low, controlled, but his frustration was clear. "So, you heard it, didn't you?" he asked, cutting straight to the point. Ethan shifted, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, I heard it. Then why didn't you say something?" James's tone was sharper now, the hurt more visible. "Why'd you just stand there and pretend like it didn't happen?" Ethan, caught off guard, stammered. "I didn't know what to say, man. I didn't want to make things worse." James scoffed, crossing his arms. "Didn't want to make things worse? By calling out something obviously wrong? You didn't think that maybe saying something would have shown me that you actually had my back?" Ethan's face fell, a wave of guilt washing over him. I'm sorry. I didn't think. I guess I was just worried I'd make it worse. Like maybe I'd overstep or something." James took a slow breath, visibly restraining his anger. "That's the thing, Ethan. You don't have to think about it. But I do. Every time someone looks at me like I don't belong, every time someone makes a comment like that, it's just a reminder that I'm different, and not in a good way." Ethan nodded, looking down, his voice quieter now. I get that. Or, I'm trying to get it. I know I messed up. I'm sorry. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the conversation settling heavily around them. James gave a curt nod, accepting the apology but still frustrated. Just, if you're going to be my friend, don't stand by next time. Be there with me. That's all I'm asking. Ethan nodded again, more resolutely this time, his face set with determination. I promise, man. I won't let you down again. The following day, Ethan found James sitting alone in the campus coffee shop, headphones on as he tapped out a rhythm on the table. Ethan took a deep breath, then approached, hoping for a chance to make things right. Mind if I sit? He asked, gesturing to the empty chair across from James. James glanced up, his face expressionless. Go ahead. Ethan sat, fidgeting slightly. He took a deep breath, launching into his apology. Look, I know I messed up last night. I should have said something. I should have shown you that I had your back, and I didn't. I'm sorry. James nodded, but his expression remained guarded. I appreciate the apology, Ethan, but it's not just about saying the words, you know? It's about understanding why it mattered. I need to know that you're willing to stand up, even when it's uncomfortable. Ethan nodded, hearing the challenge in James's words. I am, I swear. I didn't get it before, but I'm trying to understand. I want to be a real friend, not just someone who says the right things when it's easy. James looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing the sincerity in his eyes. Finally, he nodded, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. Okay, I'll give you that chance. But this isn't just a one-time thing, Ethan. If we're going to be real friends, you need to be ready for more moments like this. Ethan swallowed, but he met James's gaze squarely. I'm ready, and I won't let you down. A week later, James invited Ethan to a community center in a nearby neighborhood where he often volunteered. The center was vibrant and bustling, filled with kids laughing, playing, and chatting with volunteers. Ethan watched as James knelt down, greeting a group of kids with high fives and easy smiles. One young boy looked at Ethan with wide, curious eyes. You're James's friend, right? He asked, tugging at Ethan's sleeve. Ethan smiled, nodding. Yeah, I am. The boy grinned. James is the coolest. He teaches us basketball, and sometimes he brings his guitar and sings for us. Ethan looked over at James, surprised. He hadn't known this side of his friend, hadn't realized just how deeply James cared for the kids in his community. As he watched, he felt a new respect bloom within him. Later, as they walked back to campus, Ethan turned to James, his voice filled with admiration. The kids really look up to you. I can see why this place means so much to you. James shrugged, but there was a smile on his face. I know what it's like to grow up feeling like you're not heard. If I can give them a little bit of confidence, make them feel seen, then it's worth it. Ethan nodded, feeling a pang of gratitude for having a friend who was not only strong but selfless. You're doing something good here, man. I respect that. I really do. James looked at him, sensing the sincerity in his voice, and gave a nod of appreciation. In that moment, both of them felt the bond between them grow stronger, solidifying not only as friends, but as people who could learn from each other's worlds. That night, back in their dorm room, the quiet of the evening settling around them, Ethan lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling. The events of the past few weeks weighed on his mind. His missteps, his attempts to understand, and the world James had begun to reveal to him. He glanced over at James, who was lost in thought, earbuds in as he scribbled notes in a notebook. The sight filled Ethan with a renewed sense of purpose. James, he said softly, breaking the silence, I just want you to know, I really am listening. I know I still have a lot to learn, but I want to understand. James looked up, studying him for a moment before nodding. That's all I'm asking, Ethan. Just keep listening, and when the time comes, be ready to stand up with me. Ethan smiled, nodding, a quiet determination settling over him. They stayed up talking that night, sharing their thoughts, their dreams, and their growing understanding of what it meant to be friends in a world that didn't always make that easy. In the soft glow of their dorm room, both young men felt the weight and beauty of a friendship that was still in its infancy but already felt like something powerful, something that could change them both in ways they hadn't yet begun to imagine. Over the next few weeks, James and Ethan's friendship continued to deepen, but it was clear to both that they were wading into more complex territory. James became increasingly involved in social justice events on campus, while Ethan struggled with understanding the intensity and weight of his friend's commitment. The challenges of truly understanding each other's perspectives would come to a head, forcing both friends to confront difficult questions and confront their own beliefs, assumptions, and roles in each other's lives. The Black Student Union, BSU, was holding a rally on the main quad, organized to address the recent spike in on-campus racial incidents. As the rally grew closer, James invited Ethan to come along. Ethan, wanting to show his support, agreed, though he felt a slight pang of nervousness. The quad was a sea of posters and banners reading, "Equality for all," and "End Systemic Racism." As students gathered, James immediately became engrossed, mingling with friends and introducing Ethan to people he had met through the BSU. Ethan shook hands, exchanging polite small talk, but he felt out of place, acutely aware of how little he understood of what James and his friends were going through. The rally began with powerful speeches, each speaker addressing their own experiences with racial profiling, injustice, and the ways discrimination had impacted their lives. James nodded along, visibly moved, while Ethan stood silently, absorbing the words but feeling a mix of discomfort and confusion. As the event continued, a guest speaker, a respected local activist, took the stage, captivating the crowd with her fierce and passionate words. "Allyship," she said, her voice unwavering, "is more than standing next to someone. It's about taking action, standing up, and using your privilege to dismantle the structures that harm those who look like me, like James, and everyone here who has been hurt by prejudice. Being an ally isn't passive. It's a responsibility." Ethan's stomach tightened at her words. He realized that, up to now, he'd been passive, only scratching the surface of what allyship truly meant. He glanced over at James, who was watching the speaker with an intensity that spoke volumes. For the first time, Ethan saw just how deeply rooted this fight was in James's heart. When the rally concluded, James turned to Ethan, eyes bright with the energy of the event. "So, what did you think?" Ethan hesitated, swallowing hard. I didn't realize it was this deep for you, man. I mean, I knew it mattered to you. But this is like your whole life, isn't it?" James nodded. "It is. And it's more than just me. It's about my family, my friends. It's about people who don't have a voice, Ethan." Ethan looked away, feeling the weight of James's words. "I want to understand more. I don't know how." "Keep showing up," James replied simply. "That's where it starts." The next day, Ethan and James met for lunch at the dining hall, as they often did. But as they approached their usual table, Ethan noticed that James's friends were there too, a group of students from the BSU. James greeted them with a wave, sliding into a seat while Ethan followed, feeling a slight twinge of nervousness as he joined the conversation. The table was lively, with James's friends sharing stories and laughter, each voice contributing to the group's dynamic energy. Ethan felt more like an observer than a participant, but he listened intently, hoping to understand more of James's world. Partway through the meal, the conversation took a serious turn as one of James's friends, Marcus, mentioned a recent incident on campus where a student had been harassed by campus police. The group's tone shifted, their laughter replaced by frustration and anger. "It's like they think we don't belong here," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm just walking back to my dorm, minding my own business, and they ask me what I'm doing here. Like I'm a stranger on my own campus." Ethan listened, his brows furrowed. He'd never had an experience like that. He couldn't imagine being questioned for just existing in a space that was meant to be inclusive. "That's messed up," Ethan said, trying to contribute. "But, I mean, not all cops are bad, right? Some are just doing their job." The table fell silent, all eyes turning to him. James's gaze was intense, a mix of disappointment and frustration. "Ethan," James said quietly, "it's not about individual cops. It's about the system that allows this kind of profiling. When people say, 'not all cops are bad,' it ignores the real issue. This stuff keeps happening, and it's the system that allows it." Ethan felt a pang of embarrassment, but managed to nod. I didn't mean to downplay it. I didn't realize how bad it could get. James's friend, Shauna, spoke up, her tone firm but gentle. That's part of the privilege, Ethan. You don't have to realize it because it doesn't happen to you. But it's our reality. Every single day. The weight of her words settled heavily on Ethan. He nodded, murmuring an apology, realizing just how much he still didn't understand. For the rest of the meal, he listened more intently, the conversation reshaping his perception of the world around him. Later that night, the silence in their dorm room was thick. Ethan sat at his desk, pretending to study but unable to focus, still wrestling with his conversation from lunch. He glanced over at James, who was seated on his bed, a guitar resting on his knee as he strummed a soft, reflective tune. That sounds good, Ethan said, breaking the silence. What's it called? James looked up, his fingers pausing on the strings. It doesn't have a name yet. Just something I've been working on. There was a long pause before James spoke again, his voice quiet. Want to hear the lyrics? Ethan nodded, leaning forward as James took a deep breath and began to sing. The lyrics spoke of frustration, anger, and the search for identity. They painted a picture of a young man caught in a world that judged him for things beyond his control. A man who wanted to be seen, understood, and valued for who he was. As the last note faded, Ethan sat in silence, feeling a strange, heavy ache in his chest. James, that was powerful. I mean, really, I felt that. James nodded, meeting Ethan's eyes. That's what I want people to feel. That's why I'm here. Ethan swallowed, his voice soft. I think I get it now. Or, I'm starting to. They shared a look of understanding, and in that moment, Ethan felt closer to James than ever before, as though he were glimpsing the deepest part of his friend's soul. One weekend, James invited Ethan to visit his family. The drive to James's neighborhood was lined with trees and small businesses, a stark contrast to Ethan's small-town upbringing. When they pulled up to James's house, a modest but well-loved home with a garden out front, Ethan felt a sense of anticipation mixed with curiosity. James's mom greeted them at the door with open arms, pulling Ethan into a warm hug that instantly made him feel at home. Welcome to our home, Ethan, she said, beaming. The house was cozy, filled with the scent of spices and family photos adorning every wall. James's younger sister, Zoe, eyed Ethan curiously, eventually warming up to him when he complimented her artwork scattered around the living room. Dinner was a lively affair. James's father shared stories of his own experiences growing up, weaving tales of resilience and family pride. Ethan listened intently, absorbing the richness of the family's history. He realized that James's commitment to justice wasn't just his own. It was a continuation of his family's values, a legacy that James had inherited. As they sat around the table, Zoe asked Ethan with wide, curious eyes, "Why did you want to be friends with my brother?" Ethan chuckled, glancing at James. Honestly, he's always challenging me, making me think about things in ways I never thought to before. James's mom looked at Ethan with a gentle smile. Then you're lucky. You have a friend who won't let you settle for easy answers. Ethan nodded, feeling a new depth of appreciation for the friendship he shared with James. Back on campus, Ethan found himself in the campus library, debating with a fellow student he'd known from orientation. The student made a casual, dismissive comment about the recent rally, rolling his eyes and muttering something about people just looking for things to complain about. Ethan's pulse quickened, anger flaring inside him. He thought of James, of Marcus, of the stories he'd heard over the past weeks. That rally wasn't about complaining, Ethan replied, his tone sharper than he'd intended. It was about real issues that affect people every day. People are fighting for their right to feel safe. The other student looked at him, surprised by his tone. Calm down, man. It's just my opinion. Ethan shook his head, his voice unwavering. It's not just about opinions. It's about understanding other people's lives. Maybe if you listened, you'd get it. As he walked away, his heart pounding, Ethan felt a mix of pride and frustration. He knew he was still learning, still making mistakes, but he was beginning to understand what it meant to be a friend to James, to be an ally in a world that didn't always make that easy. That night, back in their dorm room, Ethan shared the story with James, who listened with a quiet smile. "You're getting it," James said, nodding approvingly. "You're starting to get it." And as they settled into the easy comfort of their shared space, both of them knew their friendship was growing into something solid and true, rooted in respect, understanding, and the willingness to keep learning, even when it was hard. As James and Ethan's friendship deepened, so did the complexities of navigating their worlds together. Each time Ethan felt he'd started to understand, he'd encounter something that reminded him how much he still had to learn. For James, each moment of explaining, of shouldering the emotional weight of his reality, began to wear on him. They had been tested before, but nothing had prepared them for what they would face next. A moment that would test the foundations of their bond, leaving them questioning if they truly understood each other. It was late on a Friday night, and James and Ethan were walking back from a party off campus. The streets were mostly empty, with the occasional streetlight casting long shadows. They laughed, talking about the night's events, the buzz of excitement still lingering. As they crossed the street toward campus, a police car slowly pulled up beside them. Two officers stepped out, one shining a flashlight in their direction. Ethan felt a slight pang of unease, but James immediately tensed. "Evening, gentlemen," one of the officers said, his flashlight trained on James. "Hi, officers," Ethan replied, instinctively trying to sound polite, though his voice wavered slightly. "Where are you two headed?" the other officer asked, his eyes fixated on James. "Just back to campus," James replied, his tone calm but with a noticeable edge. Ethan noticed his friend's body language, tense, guarded, like he was preparing for something he hoped wouldn't happen. "Mind if we see some ID?" one officer asked, his voice firm but oddly casual. Ethan, confused, started to reach for his wallet, but James shot him a warning look, barely shaking his head. He understood James's message. Don't move too quickly. Be careful. The officers looked at James expectantly, their hands hovering near their belts. James slowly, deliberately reached into his pocket and handed over his ID, his expression stony. Ethan handed his over as well, though the officers barely glanced at his ID, focusing almost exclusively on James. "So, where are you really coming from?" one officer pressed, looking James over with an assessing gaze. "We told you," James replied, his voice firm but calm. "We're heading back to campus." "Seems suspicious, two guys wandering around this late," the officer replied, his voice edged with suspicion. Ethan's heart pounded, anger and frustration building up as he realized what was happening. But James shot him a look that clearly said, "Let me handle this." After what felt like an eternity, the officers handed back their IDs and left, but not without a lingering look at James that spoke volumes. As the police car drove off, Ethan finally exhaled, feeling the weight of the encounter lift slightly. But when he looked at James, he saw the tension still etched in his face. "James, that was insane," Ethan said, his voice shaky. They just assumed you were up to something." James didn't respond immediately. He started walking again, his expression hard. "That's what it's like, Ethan. That's what I've been trying to tell you." Ethan felt a knot in his stomach, a sense of helplessness and anger he couldn't shake. But he couldn't find the words to say. Instead, they walked back to the dorm in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Back in the dorm room, James sat on his bed, staring at the wall, his jaw clenched. Ethan stood by his desk, pacing, the adrenaline from the encounter still coursing through him. That was just so unfair," Ethan said, finally breaking the silence. "They treated you like you were a criminal." James let out a bitter laugh, his gaze still distant. "That's not news to me, Ethan. That's my reality." Ethan struggled to find words, his frustration boiling over. "But you didn't do anything wrong. Why should you have to just take it?" James finally looked at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of hurt and exhaustion. "Because that's what I have to do. If I push back, if I argue, who knows what could happen? Do you understand now why I have to keep my head down? Why I can't afford to make the wrong move?" Ethan felt a pang of guilt, realizing the privilege he'd taken for granted. "I'm sorry, James. I never really thought about what it's like for you, having to be so careful all the time." James shook his head, his frustration palpable. "You've been listening, Ethan, but you still don't get it. And honestly, I don't know if you ever will." His words hung heavy in the air, and Ethan felt them cut deep. He wanted to argue, to tell James that he was trying his best, but he knew it wouldn't be enough. For the first time, he understood that there were things about James's experience that he could never fully grasp. The tension between them simmered over the next few days. They went through the motions of their routines, but there was a palpable distance between them. Ethan could sense that James was still upset, but he didn't know how to bridge the gap. He'd spent hours replaying the encounter with the police in his mind, feeling a combination of guilt, anger, and helplessness that gnawed at him. One evening, Ethan finally decided to bring it up. "James," he said, breaking the silence, "I don't want us to leave things like this. I don't want you to think I don't care." James looked up from his notebook, his expression wary. "It's not about whether you care, Ethan. It's about whether you understand." Ethan took a deep breath, steeling himself. "I'm trying, James. I'm really trying. But sometimes it feels like you expect me to just know what to do, to know what it's like." James's face tightened, his voice low but firm. "And that's the problem, Ethan. You'll never know what it's like. You'll never have to worry about being stopped for just walking down the street. You'll never have to think twice about how people look at you." Ethan felt his frustration building, his voice rising slightly. "I get that, James. I'm not saying I understand everything, but I'm here. I'm listening. I'm trying to be a good friend." James shook his head, his expression a mixture of anger and sadness. "It's not enough to just listen, Ethan. I need someone who's willing to stand up, not just watch from the sidelines. If you can't do that, then maybe this isn't going to work." The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. He opened his mouth to argue, to defend himself, but he realized that any response he could give would feel hollow. I don't know what to say," he admitted, his voice barely more than a whisper. James looked at him, his gaze unwavering. "Then maybe we need some time. I need some space to figure out if this is something I want to keep fighting for." With that, he grabbed his keys and walked out, leaving Ethan alone, staring at the door in stunned silence. That night, Ethan found himself walking through campus, his thoughts swirling in a storm of confusion, guilt, and frustration. He ended up at the campus park, a quiet place dotted with benches and tall, sprawling trees. The air was cool, and he shivered slightly, pulling his jacket tighter around himself. He sat down on a bench, burying his face in his hands, replaying James's words in his mind. "You'll never know what it's like." The truth of those words gnawed at him, filling him with a sense of helplessness he didn't know how to process. For the first time, he realized that he'd been approaching their friendship with an unspoken assumption that he could catch up, that if he listened and tried hard enough, he could bridge the gap between their experiences. But now he understood that some things were beyond understanding. They were simply realities that he would never face. As he sat there in the dark, he made a silent promise to himself. He would keep learning, keep pushing himself to understand as much as he could. And he would be there for James, even if it meant stepping back and letting his friend process things in his own way. The next day, James and Ethan met back at the dorm, the air thick with unresolved tension. Neither spoke, each lost in his own thoughts, until James finally broke the silence. "I think I need some time, Ethan," he said quietly. "I need space to figure out how I feel about everything. About us. About this friendship." Ethan felt his heart sink, but he nodded, his voice steady. "I understand. If you need space, I'll give it to you." They exchanged a brief, somber look, and James left the room, leaving Ethan alone, feeling a hollow ache in his chest. For the first time, he felt the weight of what he could lose, a friendship that had become a cornerstone of his college life, a bond that had shaped him in ways he hadn't even realized. As he sat alone, Ethan knew he was facing a turning point. He could either let this experience fade into a painful memory, or he could commit to understanding, growing, and becoming the friend that James deserved. With James and Ethan on a break from their friendship, both young men find themselves grappling with questions they'd previously avoided. Alone, they are forced to confront their own shortcomings, blind spots, and beliefs. Act 5 traces their separate journeys of reflection and growth as they wrestle with what went wrong, why, and what they need to do to bridge the divide between them. For the next few weeks, James and Ethan's lives moved on without each other. Each kept to his own routines, focusing on studies and avoiding the places where they would normally meet. For James, this meant diving deeper into his music and his work with the BSU, channeling his frustration and disappointment into his songwriting and activism. For Ethan, it meant immersing himself in classes, books, and new conversations, anything to distract himself from the lingering guilt and sense of loss. But in their separate paths, both young men found themselves reflecting on their friendship, each trying to make sense of the events that led to their split. The following week, Ethan returned home for a long weekend with his family. He was eager to escape the suffocating quiet of campus and hoped some time away would help clear his head. But back home, he quickly realized that the questions and conflicts from school had followed him, creeping into his thoughts and interactions. One night, at the dinner table, Ethan's father made an offhand remark about the protests and rallies happening across the country, dismissing them as just noise and disruptions. Ethan felt a wave of anger rise within him. The remark reminded him of everything James had told him, the weight of the struggle his friend faced every day. "I think it's more than just noise," Ethan said, struggling to keep his voice steady. "People are out there because they're trying to make a difference, to fight for things that matter." His father looked at him, surprised. "Ethan, since when did you start caring about these things? They're not your fights to get involved in." Ethan's face tightened. "Maybe they are my fights, but that doesn't mean I shouldn't care. I have a friend who lives this every day, Dad. Maybe it's time I start seeing things from his side." The table fell silent, his family's faces a mix of confusion and surprise. As he looked around, Ethan realized that standing up for what was right wasn't just about being with James at rallies or saying the right things. It was about defending those beliefs, even when it felt uncomfortable. The conversation with his father left him feeling emboldened, but also aware of how far he'd come and how much further he had to go. Back on campus, Ethan felt a pull to reach out to James, but knew that an apology alone wouldn't be enough. He needed to show that he understood, that he was ready to be the friend James needed, and he didn't know if he was quite there yet. One evening, he sat down and began writing a letter he knew he wouldn't send. "Not yet, at least. James," he wrote, "I've been doing a lot of thinking. I realize now that I didn't really understand what you were going through. I thought I could catch up and just understand, but I know now it's not that simple." He paused, choosing his words carefully, wanting to express his thoughts honestly. "I'm sorry for expecting you to explain everything to me, and for not standing up when it mattered most. I didn't see how much weight you were carrying until it was too late. But I'm ready to learn. I'm ready to change. And if you're ever ready to talk, I'll be here." Ethan folded the letter, tucking it into his desk drawer, unsure if he'd ever give it to James, but feeling a small weight lifted from his shoulders. Meanwhile, James had thrown himself into his music. His time away from Ethan had given him the space to work on his songs, pouring his feelings of frustration, anger, and hope into each lyric and melody. He spent hours in a small local recording studio, working with an old friend who had connections in the music scene. One evening, he recorded a new song that had been weighing on his mind. A song about friendship, betrayal, and the complexities of being seen but not understood. As he sang, he felt a surge of emotions rise within him. Anger, disappointment, but also the faint glimmer of forgiveness. His friend, watching from behind the glass, gave him an approving nod when he finished. "That's powerful, James. You should release it." James hesitated, his thoughts drifting to Ethan. The song was, in part, inspired by their journey, by the pain of being friends with someone who meant well but didn't always understand. But he realized, as he stood there in the studio, that he wanted to share his story, to give voice to the things he hadn't been able to say out loud. "Maybe I will," he replied quietly, knowing that this song was his way of reaching out, of sharing his truth. Back on campus, Ethan found himself in the library, reading a book on social justice recommended by one of James's friends from the BSU. The book was a powerful, raw account of systemic racism and privilege, written with a clarity and urgency that left him speechless. One passage struck him deeply. "Privilege isn't about what you've been given. It's about what you never had to endure." The struggles you never had to understand because the world was built to make them invisible to you. Ethan read the passage over and over, feeling the weight of each word settle heavily on him. He realized that part of his failure with James wasn't just ignorance. It was a refusal to truly step out of his own experience and see the world through his friend's eyes. He wanted to support James without stepping into the discomfort of fully challenging his own perspective. At that moment, he made a silent vow. If James ever gave him another chance, he would be ready. He would show up not just with words, but with actions, ready to listen, learn, and stand beside his friend even when it was difficult. That night, Ethan returned to his dorm room and opened the letter he'd written weeks ago. He read through it, adding a few more lines. James, I'm still learning, and I know I'll never fully understand. But I want to be the friend who stands with you, who doesn't just listen but learns, who doesn't just watch but acts. If you ever decide to give this friendship another chance, I'll be here, ready. He folded the letter, took a deep breath, and slid it into an envelope. In the morning, he placed it outside James's dorm room, unsure if his friend would respond but feeling a sense of peace in knowing he'd tried. A few days later, Ethan returned to his dorm after class and found James waiting outside his door. James held the letter, his expression unreadable, but there was a softness in his eyes that Ethan hadn't seen in weeks. They stood in silence for a moment before James finally spoke. I got your letter. Ethan nodded, his heart pounding. Thanks for reading it. James looked at him, his gaze thoughtful. I needed space, Ethan, but I also needed to see that you were willing to put in the work, not just say you were sorry. I get that, Ethan replied, his voice quiet. And I'll keep putting in the work, whether we're friends again or not. I just want you to know that I'm here, ready to be the friend you need. James nodded, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. I appreciate that, and I want us to try again. But it won't be easy, Ethan. This isn't something that just gets fixed with an apology. Ethan nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and determination. I understand, and I'm ready. They stood there, a renewed understanding passing between them, each recognizing that their friendship would require effort, honesty, and a willingness to confront hard truths. But in that moment, both felt a renewed hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild their bond stronger than before. With a foundation rebuilt on mutual respect and understanding, James and Ethan commit to nurturing their friendship while also pursuing their own paths with newfound purpose. They learn that growth doesn't end with forgiveness. It's an ongoing process requiring dedication and action. In Act 6, they navigate the challenges of post-reconciliation, face the realities of activism and allyship, and look ahead to a future shaped by their experiences and the profound bond they forged. A few weeks after their reconnection on campus, James and Ethan decided to meet up at their favorite spot on campus, the quiet bench by the old oak tree in the quad. It was early evening, and the setting sun cast a warm glow over the space, creating an atmosphere perfect for the deep conversation they both knew they needed. As they sat down, Ethan looked at James, his face a mixture of determination and vulnerability. James, I want us to be clear. I know I have a lot to learn, and I'm not just expecting you to teach me. I want you to know that I'm committed to doing the work on my own, too. James nodded, his expression thoughtful. I appreciate that, Ethan. You know, I've been thinking a lot, too. This whole journey has taught me that growth goes both ways. I can't expect people to understand everything about my experience right away, but I need people around me who are willing to show up, who'll stand by me in this fight. And I see that in you. Ethan took a deep breath. I'm here, James, and not just for you. I'm here because I believe in what you're doing, in what you're fighting for. They shared a long look, a silent understanding passing between them. In that moment, they reaffirmed their bond, not just as friends, but as two people committed to walking beside each other in a world that didn't always make that easy. As a way to celebrate their newfound closeness, James invited Ethan to one of his most important performances yet, an open mic night where he would perform a song that was deeply personal, inspired by the struggles he'd faced and the lessons he'd learned over the past year. The campus auditorium was packed that night, the room buzzing with energy and anticipation. Ethan arrived early, saving a seat in the front row and watching his students fill the room, many of whom were there to support James and his message. He felt a strange mix of pride and nervousness as he thought about what this performance meant for his friend and for their friendship. James took the stage, his guitar in hand, the spotlight illuminating his focused expression. He introduced his song with a few words. This song is about the struggles we face, the resilience we find, and the allies who stand by us, even when it's hard, he said, his eyes briefly meeting Ethan's in the crowd. As James strummed the opening chords and began to sing, Ethan was struck by the raw emotion in his friend's voice. The lyrics spoke of fear, resilience, anger, and hope, each line filled with a vulnerability that left the audience spellbound. James's words painted a picture of a young man caught in a world that judged him before it knew him, and the fight to be heard and understood. When the song ended, there was a brief moment of silence before the audience erupted in applause. Ethan rose to his feet, clapping louder than anyone, his heart swelling with admiration and pride. In that moment, he understood the power of James's voice, not just as his friend but as an artist, an advocate, and a person committed to making change. Backstage after the performance, Ethan found James and pulled him into a hug. "You were incredible, man," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so proud of you." James smiled, his expression softened. "Thanks, Ethan. It means everything to have you here." A week after the open mic night, the BSU organized a rally to bring attention to the lack of diverse faculty and underrepresentation of minority voices in curriculum choices. Ethan had always been supportive of James's activism, but this time he wanted to be more than just a bystander. He wanted to stand up with his friend, to make his commitment visible. Ethan met James in the quad, where students had gathered with signs and banners. There was an intensity to the atmosphere, a mix of anger, hope, and solidarity that felt almost electric. Ethan held a sign, his expression serious, as he took his place beside James, who led chants and rallied the crowd with his powerful words. Throughout the rally, Ethan saw firsthand the reactions of other students and faculty, some supportive, others wary or dismissive. But he didn't let it shake him. He knew that standing here was about more than making himself feel good. It was about lending his voice and presence to a cause that mattered. After the rally, as they packed up, James looked at him, a spark of gratitude in his eyes. "Thanks for being here, Ethan. It means a lot." Ethan smiled, his expression sincere. "This is where I want to be, right here with you." In that moment, they both felt a deep sense of purpose, a shared mission that transcended their friendship, something that connected them as allies in a larger fight. Later that night, back in their dorm room, James and Ethan talked about their hopes and fears, reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. "You know," Ethan said, leaning back against his bed, "when we first met, I thought I knew a lot about the world, but I've realized how much I didn't know, how much I'd been ignoring." James nodded thoughtfully. "And I thought I'd have to do this fight alone. But you've shown me that change can come from the most unexpected places. We're in this together." They raised their soda cans in a toast to growth, accountability, and keeping each other grounded. Ethan said, grinning. "To friendship that stands the test of time," James added. They clinked their cans together, sealing a pact to keep learning from each other, to hold each other accountable, and to never stop fighting for what was right. They both knew that this friendship wasn't just something they'd stumbled into. It was something they were choosing to build, brick by brick, even when it was hard. Months passed, and graduation day arrived. The campus was filled with families, laughter, and the bittersweet excitement that comes with closing one chapter and opening another. Ethan and James, both dressed in their caps and gowns, took a moment to meet in the crowd, their families nearby, sharing smiles and taking photos. "You ready for this?" James asked, his eyes twinkling with excitement. Ethan laughed. "As ready as I'll ever be. Hard to believe we made it here, huh?" They shared a smile, each of them aware of the journey they'd taken to get to this moment. Their friendship had been tested, broken, and rebuilt stronger than before. Now, as they prepared to move forward into the unknown, they felt a deep sense of gratitude for each other. After the ceremony, they took a photo together, both holding up their diplomas, grinning at the camera. It was more than a graduation picture. It was a testament to the resilience of their friendship and the lessons they taught each other. After the graduation festivities, they returned to their dorm to pack up their belongings. As they boxed up memories, photos, and mementos from their time at college, they reflected on the experiences that had shaped them. Ethan found a letter he'd written to James during their time apart and handed it to him. "Remember this?" James nodded, a small smile crossing his face. "I kept it. Every time I read it, it reminds me of how far we've come." They sat in silence for a moment, both feeling the weight of the memories they'd shared. The late-night talks, the moments of anger, the quiet realizations, and the hard-won forgiveness. "You know," James said, his voice soft, "I don't think I would have made it through college without you." Ethan looked at him, his eyes bright with emotion. "I feel the same way. You changed my life, James. Made me a better person." As they finished packing, they exchanged a long, heartfelt hug, knowing that this wasn't the end. Their paths might diverge, but they would always be connected by the bond they'd built. In the months that followed, they kept in touch through texts, calls, and the occasional visit. Ethan pursued a career in social work, dedicating his life to advocating for marginalized communities and supporting young people in need. His experiences with James had left a permanent mark, shaping his work with empathy, patience, and the drive to be an ally for those who needed it most. James, meanwhile, achieved early success as a musician, releasing songs that spoke to social issues, resilience, and the power of community. His lyrics resonated with listeners across the country, each performance a testament to his commitment to making change through his art. He knew that every song, every word, carried forward the lessons he'd learned from his journey with Ethan. One summer afternoon, during a visit, they sat at a cafe, sharing updates about their lives, work, and dreams. "You still fighting the good fight?" Ethan asked, grinning. James chuckled. "Always. And I know you are too. We might be on different paths, but we're still in this together." They toasted their coffee cups, a silent vow to continue supporting each other, to keep growing, and to carry forward the lessons they learned. Their friendship had become more than just a connection. It was a shared mission, a testament to the power of empathy, resilience, and the courage to bridge divides. And as they walked away, side by side, they knew that their journey was far from over. The world was still filled with challenges and injustices, but they were ready to face them together, each in their own way, knowing that true friendship wasn't about understanding every detail. It was about showing up, standing by each other, and building a bridge that would endure. They were ready for whatever lay ahead, strengthened by a friendship that had been tested, broken, and rebuilt. Not just as friends, but as allies, and, in many ways, as family.